Simio is proud to announce their latest software release, Simio 11. This video will guide you through all the new and exciting features and enhancements that has been introduced to Simio since the last major release. Batch Logic Element and Standard Library Combiner. New properties. For a batch logic element or standard library combiner, you can now specify a repeat group of batch quantity requirements, batch quantities, more, that is required to be collected and attached to each parent entity. Additionally, a must simultaneously batch property has been added. For example, suppose that a combiner, the parent entities represent pallets and the following quantities and entity types are required to be packed onto each pallet. In the batching logic properties of a combiner, you can now easily model the prior example by simply specifying the batch quantity and matching rule information as a repeating list of requirements, like this. There is also a new Boolean property, must simultaneously batch, that indicates whether the full target number of member entities must be available before any can be collected and attached to a parent entity. If this property is false, then batch members will be collected from the batch logic's member queue and the combiner's member input buffer as soon as they become available. The parent entity eventually gets released once the target batch quantity or quantities are reached. If this property is true, then no batch members can be collected by a parent entity until its full target batch quantity or quantities are available. In that case, the collection of all batch members and release of the parent entity is always going to happen as a single event at a single point in time. Note that one possible result of forcing simultaneous batching is parent entities may jump over other parent entities in the parent queue if requirements differ between parents. For example, if there is only one member entity waiting, but the parent entity at the front of the queue needs two member entities, then that parent entity will have to wait until two are available before collecting any. However, if a parent entity behind it in the queue needs only one member entity, then that parent will be able to immediately collect it, thus jumping the queue ranking. Data Table, Row Editing in Property Grid. Within the facility window, when a user selects an object or multiple objects, the property grid is provided for data input. We have now added this capability to Data Table Row Editing. When a single or multiple rows are selected within a data table, the property grid now displays the column data for a single row or common data for multiple rows. This enables the user to multi-select or filter to rows and more easily edit multiple fields. Data Table, Data Binding Import Enhancements. Within data tables, when a table is bound to a file, a message will be shown displaying the time of the last import, X days, Y hours, and Z minutes ago. If the data table is bound to a file, but data not yet imported, that will be noted as well. Also, within data tables, there is now an option to import the bound data upon loading the simulation model. This option is available with Simio RPS only. Input Parameters, Table Value Enhancements. Within input parameters, when an input parameter is based on a table value, the user now has more flexibility on what data within the table data is sampled. There is a new Ignore Zero Values property that may be used to filter out zero values from the table. If this property is set to true and zero is sampled, the simulation will simply resample. Additionally, the user may specify a starting index, which defaults to 1, and/or ending index, which defaults to all. Simio will then only sample from that subset of rows. Project Home Ribbon, Modeling Helper Add-ins, RPS only. Users can now author design time modeling helper add-ins. These are pieces of code bound to a specific model. The place a user starts to implement them is the Simio API.extensions.imode iHelper add-in interface. They get loaded with the model and unloaded when the model is closed. They have access to the full iModel Design Time API. They can subscribe to events on the model, right now only save. They can augment the model's property display and put their own properties in there as well. They specify an environment under which they are valid to run. Right now, the only section is desktop. A normal Simio install will have no model helpers installed along with it. By selecting something in the drop list, the user enables or disables that add-in for the active model. Once any add-ins have been enabled, that will disable undo, redo. Simio will make sure you know this. Enabled add-ins can optionally add their own properties alongside the model's properties. Batch Logic Element and Standard Library Combiner. Release Batch Early Triggers. For a batch logic element or standard library combiner, you can now specify options for releasing batches early, either based on time or events occurring in the system. Release batch early triggers repeat group properties. The release batch early triggers defined for a parent entity can be either time-based, trigger fires when specified wait duration expires, or event-based, trigger fires when a specified event occurs. By default, the release decision when a trigger has fired is always, but may alternatively be conditional or probabilistic. Off-shift rule for secondary resources. Switch resources if possible. Previously, when a secondary resource was used within an object for general processing or within task processing, the user had two options for off-shift rule, including suspend processing and finish work already started. We have now enhanced the off-shift rule to also include switch resources if possible. This will allow processing to continue when a shift change occurs, which changing the secondary resource. For example, first shift worker and second shift worker are members of a worker list. At a server, if a process begins at 3:45 p.m. during first shift and lasts for 3 hours into second shift, when the first shift worker goes off shift, Simio will seize a second shift worker, if available, to continue the processing the entity at the server. Task, new function. We have added a new task function. Task.primaryToken returns a reference to the token that is executing the task's primary process. Seize and release step, multiple enhancements. To support the above switch resources if possible option for off-shift rule, we have added several properties to seize and release steps. First, within the seize step, we have added a quantity type property under advanced options that indicates the type of resource quantity to seize. The options are specific, which represents the exact quantities entered in the number of objects and units per object's properties, and deficient, which is derived by subtracting the already seized resources of the specified resource type from the quantities entered in the number of objects and unit per object properties. For example, if the number of objects property is specified as 5, and the number of already seized resources that meet the requirement is 3, then the deficient number of resource objects to seize is calculated to be 2. Then, within both the seize and release steps, we've added a seize resources filter type property that can be set to none or token. With the token option, an additional property named filter token reference can be specified. To see how these new properties are used, please review the on-secondary resource capacity changed process within a subclassed server or review the Simio help for these steps. Unrelated to the switch resources of possible enhancement, the seize and release steps now include a use strict list referencing property. For the seize step, if seizing from list and quantity type is deficient, this indicates whether the already seized resources must have been seized from the same specified list, instead of merely being members of the list. For the release step, if releasing from list, this indicates whether the released resources must have been seized from the same specified list, instead of merely being members of the list. This is particularly useful when resources are members of multiple lists. Create Step Enhancement. Within the Create step, we've added the option to create a new token into the process. The Create step may now be used to create new entity objects of a specified type, create copies of an existing entity, or to simply create new tokens that reference existing objects. New tokens associated with the created or referenced objects will exit the created exit point of the step. When a new token is created using the Create step, the user can specify the token associated object and/or the token context object. If not specified, the associated object reference and/or context object reference of the original token executing the Create step will be assumed. Allocating resources when capacity increased. Advanced compatibility setting change. In Run Setup, Advanced Compatibility Settings, the default value for new models of the Schedule Late Current Event to try allocating when resource capacity increased compatibility setting has been changed from false to true. This setting indicates whether to schedule a late priority current event to try allocating whenever the capacity of a resource has been increased. Otherwise, allocation will be immediately attempted before the execution of any other simulation logic in the system. In the standard library, the vehicle and worker objects on-capacity changed process logic has also been modified to delay for epsilon time when coming on shift before any attempt to allocate the vehicle or worker resource. If using the switch resources if possible off-shift rule for secondary resource requirements at a server, this change now means that the default behavior of that feature is WIP tasks. Attempting resource switching will have priority seizing secondary resources coming on shift before any new tasks that have been waiting in the resource allocation queues are able to try to seize. Seize Selection Goal Enhancement. In Run Setup, Advanced Compatibility Settings, and always use Seize Selection Goal when checking Resource Allocation Queue compatibility setting has been added. This setting indicates whether a seize step selection goal should be used not only at the initial seize attempt, but also whenever any resource allocation queue check occurs, if waiting for resources is necessary, regardless of the must simultaneous seize option setting. The recommended value for this setting is true, but will be set at false for older models built prior to Sprint 186. In a simple example, suppose an entity is waiting to seize from a worker list, but all the workers are currently off shift. Thus, the entity waits in all the allocation queues of the resource candidates. Then suppose all the workers in the list come on shift. In the old software behavior, if the compatibility setting is left at false for an old model, whichever candidate's resources shift change happened to be processed first, usually based on the order that objects were placed in the model, was always the resource seized. The selection goal, i.e. resource selection rule, specified on the seize step would be ignored. Now, what happens is regardless of which candidate resource happens to be checking its allocation queue, an entity always tried to seize the best candidate resource per the specified selection goal on the seize step. In the simple worker example described above, all the workers come on shift, and then the entity seizes the best one per whatever resource selection rule has been specified. This has always been the way things worked if using the must simultaneously seize option, but now that behavior is consistent across the board. Experimentation Scenario Timestamp. We have added the ability to add a scenario timestamp column to the experiment scenarios. To view this column, right-click on a column header, such as Status, Required, or any column header in the experiment view. Select Column Band Chooser, and a small box appears. In the box, double-click Last Run Completed At. It now appears next to Status column. To hide the column, right-click Last Run Completed At, and select Hide this column. Entity Gantt Constraint Destination Enhancement RPS Edition. We have added the destination availability constraints information on the entity Gantt now shows the name of the parent item where entities are queued. The constraint log column named Facility Location now tracks the entity location. New Project Templates. We have removed the Scheduling and Wonderware MES buttons found on the Content ribbon within the Data tab. Users can now use the File New from Template option to view a selection of templates that are pre-installed with Simio. Users may also create their own templates by just saving a project file, ideally with a name, icon, and description set in the project properties, and saving it to the project templates location. C Drive, Users, Public, Documents, Simio, Project Templates. Project Recovery Files option. In File Settings within the Application Settings window, there are now two new settings for project recovery. By default, this feature is off, as the minutes between recovery save is set to 0, and the save for auto recovery before run is set to false. If a user was to turn one of those on to get a recovery save, wait the time limit or run, then end Simio using end task through the task manager or other unexpected crash, the next time a Simio instance starts up, the user will see clicking OK opens the recovery save, saves it in a new file named Project Name, Recovered, and deletes the recovery save. Clicking Cancel keeps the recovery save. Users can explicitly delete them by deleting the contents of Local App Data Simio Recovery Directory, where %local app data % is configured on most systems to be C Drive, Users, Username, App Data, Local. Seize Step Enhancement. The seize step now includes an immediately try seize property that allows the user to specify whether to immediately seize any available resources or to allow other same-time events within Simio's event calendar to occur prior to seizing any available resources. This feature is used within the Switch Resources if Possible logic for secondary resources off-shift rule option. Workstation object within standard object library, deprecated. The Workstation object has now been deprecated from the standard object library. Note that any models that include Workstation object instances will continue to see the Workstation object in the library. Existing models that do not contain any workstations, as well as new models, will not have that object visible within the library. Object visibility within a library, updated. The visible in library model level property has changed to library visibility. A user can explicitly show or hide deprecated objects from the library right-click menu. This menu item is only enabled for libraries with deprecated objects in them. Note that a deprecated object will be shown if it has any instances in the associated model, no matter the Show Deprecated Objects setting. A new Immediately Try Allocate Boolean property is now available for the release step. Note that the default value of this property is true, the present behavior. This feature is useful when multiple resources may be released simultaneously, as setting this property to false will allow entities in resource allocation queues to wait until all resources have been released before attempting to allocate a resource to an entities based on any resource selection rules. Server, Combiner, Separator, Filler, Emptier Enhancement. For Server, Combiner, Separator, Filler, and Emptier objects, we have added a Process Logic, Other Processing Options category in the Properties window with Immediately Try Seize and Immediately Try Allocate when released properties. By default, those properties are false and true respectively. Note that for any model saved in an earlier library object version, both those properties will be loaded with the value true, as that was the previous implicit behavior. The default of Immediately Try Allocate when released for the primary resource is set to true, so that by default, the process logic will allow a new entity waiting for the server, or other object type, to immediately seize it when the server has been released by the previous entity, so as to potentially be first inserted into allocation queues for secondary resources before any secondary resource allocation attempts occur. For all the same objects, there are also the same new properties within the Secondary Resources, Resource for Processing, Advanced Options category as they relate to the secondary resource. By default, those properties are both false. Note that for any model saved in an earlier library object version, both those properties will be loaded with the value true, as that was the previous implicit behavior. For a server, combiner, or separator object, if using the process type task sequence within the Resource Requirements Advanced Options category in the Properties window of a processing task, there are new Immediately Try Seize and Immediately Try Allocate when released properties. By default, those properties are both false. Note that for any model saved in an earlier library object version, both those properties will be loaded with the value true, as that was the previous implicit behavior. Updated Simbit. We have added updated Simbits during this release. Updated Combine Multiple Entity Types onto Palettes. This new Simbit replaces the previous Combine Multiple Parts task sequence. This Simbit essentially models the same example, but now simply uses the new Batch Quantities repeat group on the combiner to define the batch quantity requirements. Task sequences, extra process logic, data tables, etc. are no longer required to model this sort of problem. Updated Combiner Releasing Batch Early. This new Simbit replaces the previous reneging combiner Simbit. This new Simbit simply uses the Release Batch Early Triggers feature instead of a parent input buffer renege trigger approach with a standalone extra node that then reroutes the entity back into the combiner, extra state assignments to recalculate available batch quantities, etc. Workstation Simbits, updated to Server Simbits. Server with Material Consumption. This new Simbit replaces the previous Workstation with Material Consumption Simbit. This new Simbit uses the Material Requirements section of properties within a server task sequences to consume and produce materials required for processing. Server with Material Consumption and Replenishment. This Simbit is a second model within the above Server with Material Consumption project and replaces the previous Workstation with Material Consumption and Replenish Simbit. In addition to using the task sequence type processing for material requirements, it also uses monitor elements to track the material inventory and produce steps within processes to handle material replenishment. Scheduled material arrivals. This updated Simbit includes now material consumption within the task sequence type processing of a server instead of within a workstation object. A data file is used to specify material arrival times into the system. Scheduled material arrivals with deviation. This updated Simbit now includes material consumption within the task sequences of a server instead of within a workstation object. The model shows how variation around the material arrival times affects a system. Using relational tables. This updated Simbit now uses server objects in place of workstation objects in the facility window. The model includes data that exist in different tables, and the tables are linked together with foreign keys, as in a relational database. Server with sequence-dependent setup. This new Simbit replaces the previous workstation with sequence-dependent setup Simbit. The server uses task sequence type processing to specify sequence-dependent setup between various part types in the system. Financials. This updated Simbit now includes server objects in place of workstation objects. The model demonstrates how to calculate costs, such as capital cost of objects, usage costs, holding costs, and the cost of transporting an entity on a vehicle. Relational tables and repeating property. This updated Simbit now uses servers in place of workstations for processing multiple patient entity types through a system. Relational data tables are used to specify different processing times, as well as multiple doctors and/or nurses for processing for the patient types. Ability to view product version for model. We have added the ability to view the product version and date with which the model was saved. Users can right-click on the project name within the navigation window to see the project properties. The date saved and saved in version fields are now available. This was a user-requested feature. Consume step on consumed process. The consume step now includes an option process to be executed when material is consumed. The created token's material order detail reference will provide the detail of the material consumption. This process will be executed anytime a quantity of material is consumed, either a full or partial allocation. Consume, produce, reserve, unreserve, and route step enhancements. The consume, produce, reserve, unreserve, and route steps now include an inventory site type property, which can be specified as none, default, associated object, parent object, or specific object. Additionally, the site object name property will then be visible if the inventory site type is specific object. This allows these steps to then work with the inventory element features. If consuming, producing, reserving, or unreserving a single material that is location-based inventory, then Simio will look up the inventory element holding the specified material at the specified inventory site. If producing a bill of materials, then Simio will look up the inventory elements holding the component materials at the specified inventory site. This holds true for routing with required materials as well. Fixed object function added. When a fixed object, such as a server, combiner, separator, or transfer node, is specified as the site object name of an inventory element, the function inventory material can be used. Inventory material returns a reference to the inventory holding the specified material at this fixed object. If there is no such inventory defined, then the nothing keyword is returned. Inventory element inventory position function. A new inventory position function has been added for inventory elements that is equal to the inventory's quantity in stock plus quantity on order minus quantity backordered minus quantity reserved, excluding reserved units already backordered. Inventory element replenishment features. Within the inventory element, we have added multiple properties to handle inventory replenishment, including review period, replenishment policy, and on-replenishment order process. The review period determines the frequency of inventory review to determine whether a replenishment order is required. This can be none, continuous, or timer. The replenishment policy property can be specified as none, custom reorder condition, min and max, order up to, or reorder point and reorder quantity. Finally, an on-replenishment order process property can be executed to handle an inventory replenishment order. The initiation of this process automatically increments the inventory's quantity on order. The created token's material order detail reference, new, will provide the detail of the order replenishment. Material and inventory. Partial allocation. For a material element, there is now an Allow Partial Allocation If property that is a default optional condition indicating whether an entity may immediately consume only a portion of its requested quantity if the full quantity is not available. If the condition evaluates to true, the entity will consume the partial amount, but will still wait until the entire quantity fulfilled before moving from consume step. For an inventory element, we also added an Allow Partial Allocation If property that is an optional condition indicating whether an entity may immediately consume only a portion of its requested quantity if the full quantity is not available. If specified, then this condition will override the Allow Partial Allocation If on the material element associated with the inventory. Material and inventory elements. Quantity on order state. For both the material and inventory elements, we have added a quantity on order state variable that returns the quantity of the material that has been ordered to replenish inventory in the system but has not yet been received. If a material is not location-based inventory, this value will return 0. Otherwise, it is automatically assigned the value of the total aggregate quantity on order across all inventory sites and is not user assignable. The inventory's quantity on order state may also be assigned using the assign step. New inventory element. A new inventory element may be used to define a storage bucket for holding stock of a specific material. A site object name property is provided to designate a fixed object in the facility window, such as a server or transfer node, as the inventory's physical location. The inventory element is now available from the Elements ribbon. Note, organization of buttons within the Elements ribbon has also changed slightly. Materials specified within the simulation model may then be associated with the inventory locations. New product additions. In this release, we've introduced 2 new products as a step towards simplifying our product line. Simio Professional Edition. Simio Professional Edition provides the same functionality as Simio Design. However, it allows building and distribution of models using the freely available Simio Personal Evaluation version as a runtime platform. Models built with the Simio Professional Edition will run and generate results with the Simio Personal version. Simio Professional Edition is ideal for consultants that want to deliver a running model to their customer. It also provides the capability to distribute scenarios and replications across computers in a work group. Simio Professional Edition includes output tables and states, and Gantt charts for the interactive runs and validation. Simio RPS Edition. Simio RPS Edition adds a powerful set of patented features to build and execute new models for risk-based planning and scheduling, RPS. This edition provides full scheduling capabilities, custom Taylor reports, graphs, and tables for use by schedulers. Reduce your risk and costs by analyzing your schedules in ways never before possible. New schema and content ribbons to replace table ribbons. Within a model's data ribbon and tables panel, the data window will now include both a schema and content ribbon, replacing the table ribbon and states and targets ribbons that was shown for some Simio versions. When you first navigate to Data and Tables, if no tables exist yet, Simio defaults to the Schema ribbon. Otherwise, the Content ribbon is shown. Within the Schema ribbon, users can add any type of table, including data tables, sequence tables, and output tables, available in Simio Professional and RPS. All users will have the option to add standard property columns, as well as element reference, object reference, and foreign key properties. The Schema ribbon now contains the contents of the old States ribbon, which will allow users to add standard state columns, as well as element reference, object reference, and foreign key states, available in Simio Professional and RPS. The Schema ribbon also contains a target from the old Targets ribbon. Targets are used within the Simio RPS edition. The Scheduling and Wonderware MES add-ins now appear on the Schema ribbon in a new Templates group. The Content ribbon allows users to edit the content of the table, including binding to data sources, importing and exporting, as well as the adjusting the target performance classification slider. Produce step. Record as order received if property. The produce step now includes a record as order received condition property, which, if true and the material is location-based inventory, then the inventory's quantity on order is automatically decremented by either the produced quantity or to 0, the latter if the produced quantity is greater than the quantity on order. Resource Usage Log and Task Log Enhancement. We have added two properties to the custom column fields within the Resource Usage Log and the Task Log. The Add Column button on the Log ribbon is used to add custom columns to the logs. This is typically done to provide the user with additional details information on a tooltip or to categorize the resources or tasks. However, there are some instances when the extra columns is used to provide information on the Gantt, border color, for example, but the user may not wish to have it shown on the hover tooltip and/or categorization fields dropdowns. The Show in Gantt tooltips and Show in Gantt dropdowns properties have been added to allow the user to turn off false the display of the custom column in various places. Right-click, Export View to. We have added a new right-click option on the table areas, tables, experiment, etc., that allows users to export the table view to several different sources, such as Excel, CSV, PDF, HTML, and Word. Standard Library Enhancements: Server, Combiner, Separator, and Transfer Node. The Server, Combiner, Separator objects have been modified to have inventory site type and site object name properties within the task sequences. Required Materials section of Properties. This will allow users to specify on a task basis the inventory site area, if any, from which to consume or produce materials. Additionally, the Transfer Node object has been enhanced to allow required materials before routing out to include material that is location-based inventory. States and functions for inventory element. The states for the inventory element include quantity in stock, the current quantity of material present in the inventory. Allocation queue accesses the inventory's queue of material consumption requests. Separator buffer logic support for bulking and reneging from member output buffer. We added support for bulking and reneging from most input and output buffers from within the standard library objects. However, one buffer that this did not include was the member output buffer for the separator object. This object has now been enhanced to include the bulking and reneging features as well. New token wait action for create, remove, unbatch, and search steps. The create, remove, unbatch, and search steps all consist of the original or parent token exit from the right of the step, as well as the created, removed, member, and found exit from the bottom of the step. By default, the created, removed, member, and found tokens will exit first and continue until a delay in processing, followed by the original and parent token processing. The use of a delay step with math.epsilon could have been used to change this processing order. These steps now include a token wait action property to help users determine how the tokens exit the step. For compatibility, the default value of this property is new tokens exit first, which allows the tokens to exit and process as they always have. Two additional options are no wait and wait until new token processing completed. No wait indicates that the execution of any new tokens from created, removed, member, and found to exit will be scheduled on the simulation's current event calendar as an early priority event, and that the original or parent token will immediately exit the step first. If the action is wait until new token processing completed, the original token will wait until the processing has been completed for all new tokens associated with created, removed, member, and found before exiting. This includes any delay steps of math.epsilon that the new tokens may encounter. Search Steps Enhancements. Because of feedback from our Simio conference, we have made several other changes to the search step functionality, including 1. The collection type Reservation Owners is now available to search the list of objects that have currently reserved capacity of a specified resource. 2. If searching table rows, the table row references of the original token are now copied to any new tokens. Search steps and models built prior to Sprint 166 will run as they had and not include this functionality. 3. The search types forward and backward no longer sum a specified search expression. Those search types are now simply for the most common use case of searching a collection of objects or rows of a table with an optional match condition. This simplifies the default presentation of the search steps properties by no longer showing search expression. New forward sum expression and backward sum expression search types are now provided if the expression summing behavior is desired. Search steps added prior to Sprint 166 will now have forward sum expression instead of forward and backward sum expression instead of backward for compatibility reasons. 4. In conjunction with the above change, a new Save Search Expression Sum property is now provided along with the Search Expression property if the search type is Minimize Expression, Maximize Expression, Forward Sum Expression, or Backward Sum Expression. This new approach was done to make it easier for users to both understand step behavior as well as to avoid unit conversion mistakes because we can save the search expression sum in a state variable of some unit type. 5. The limit property has been moved from the advanced options section of properties to the basic logic section of properties, as requested by several users. 6. While making the other enhancements in this list, a small performance improvement in the code was identified if searching table rows. Simple test models run about 5 to 6% faster after the change. Routing Group Element on confirming destination node assignment process. Within the advanced options of the routing group element, we have added a new process that may be called on confirming destination node assignment process. This was a user-requested feature. When using a dynamic selection rule, the existing onEvaluating route request process is executed for every possible entity and destination node combination to filter the list of possible destination node assignments. The best destination node assignment from the candidates that made it through the filtering is then selected per the specified rule. The new onConfirming destination node assignment process, on the other hand, is only executed whenever a destination node assignment has been selected to confirm it. If this decision process returns false, then the routing group goes back to the drawing board and, using the same dynamic selection rule again, looking for the next best entity and node combination, which would then have to be confirmed, and so forth. Suspend and Resume Steps Enhancement. Both the Suspend and Resume steps now allow the ability to suspend and resume batching done within a batch logic element. The Suspend type and Resume type properties on these steps now include the option for batch logic. Standard Library Combiner. New Suspend Batching when down property. There is a new property for the combiner object within the standard library, within the batching logic section of properties. When the Suspend Batching when down is set to true, the actual collection of batches will be stopped if the combiner has failed or changes capacity to 0 from a work schedule shift change. This means that the parent and member entities will reside in the input queues of the combiner and not attempt batching. If this new property is set to false, parent and member entities will continue the batching process and will be removed from the parent and member input queues, but will not move through the combiner object until the failure is repaired or work schedule changes. Note: the default value of this property is true for new models, but false if updating an old model, as that was the implicit setting in the previous object versions. Model Properties and Compatibility. Parse non-entity associated objects for property reference. Within a model's property window, under the Advanced Options and Compatibility section of Properties, we have added a Parse non-entity associated objects for property reference property. In models built in Sprint 166 and prior, this value will implicitly be set to false. This was a user-requested issue that changed previous software behavior. Now, within 167+, an object, such as a custom server named MyServer for example, may have a property, such as a table-type property named MyTable, that can be referenced within the main model when that object is placed. A setRow step may reference myserv.myTable as the table name property to set a particular table, based on the associated object MyServer's property value for MyTable, row reference for any of the MyServer objects placed in a model. Simio file, settings, graphics, DirectX 11, anti-aliasing, and hardware skeletal animation support. There are now a few new options in the File Settings dialog related to graphics. 1. An expanded set of options for the graphics type. Note that DirectX or Software DirectX currently actually mean DirectX 9. Users also can explicitly say which DirectX they want. 2. A new anti-aliasing support option. When Auto is selected, it will be enabled for DirectX 11 and disabled for everything else. 3. A new hardware skeletal animation option. When in Auto mode, will be enabled by default for DirectX 11, disabled for others. Resource type objects. Log resource usage property enhancement. Within any resource type of object, such as server, worker, vehicle, etc., there is a log resource usage property under the Advanced Options section of Properties. This Boolean true or false property can now be mapped to a model property. This is useful if you want to, for example, set up different groupings of resources that can be selectively included in the resource Gantt by toggling a single property on the model. Entity Workflow Gantt Enhancement, Enterprise Edition. In September 2017, we made some changes to the Entity Workflow Gantt to allow for task categorization using task group and task row within the Gantt ribbon. Now, we've added a different type of categorization within the main entity portion of the Gantt to allow for additional categorization as well. The new Owner Row option within the Gantt ribbon allows the user to split out the main time items into sub-rows under the main row. The default entity Gantt for a given order, which may consist of a quantity of entity items. Users can now specify a resource usage log custom column for Owner Row that will generate sub-rows based on the column information. The item or entity within the order is used as the Owner Row. This feature is especially useful for entities that have multiple components of processing occurring at the same time with multiple workers and resources also allocated at that location. The location itself can then Task Log and Gantt Enhancements, Task State, Enterprise Edition. We have added a task state log and incorporated the information to the task ID field within the task log. There are now 3 possible task states in the log and associated Gantts. 1. Executing. The task was executing, incurring the specified processing time, solid. 2. Constrained. An active constraint was holding up execution of the task, for example, waiting time for a secondary resource or some material, empty. 3. Suspended. The execution of the task was suspended. This will happen if the primary resource or a secondary resource goes off shift, and the off shift rule is suspend processing. Hatched. Task Sequence Element Enhancement, Loopback Branches. We've enhanced the task sequences element to include a repeating property editor of loopback branches. This will allow for users to include conditional and/or probabilistic looping within a task sequence. After task 3, 50% of the entities will loop back to task 2 and continue processing through the task sequence again. After task 4, 25% of the entities will loop back to task 2 and continue processing through the task sequence again. Server, Combiner, and Separator, Loopback Branches Enhancements. With the addition of the loopback branches to the task sequence element, these same enhancements have been made to the server, combiner, and separator. All these objects currently include the task sequence option for specifying processing information. If the object's processing type is set to task sequence, and there are 1 or more entries in the processing task's repeating editor, the loopback branches option will be shown. Server, Combiner, and Separator, Task Sequence Process Type Enhancements. A State Assignments property category is now available for an individual processing task within the task sequence processing of a server, combiner, or separator. This will allow users to make changes to state variables within the repeatable property editor instead of going through an add-on process. State assignments can be made when the task is ready to begin, not yet seizing resources or consuming materials. Starting the task, resources and materials available, task delay about to start, or completed. Breakpoints Enhancement. There is a new setting in the File Settings dialog, defaulted to false, opting everyone into perfect breakpoints. We have had several instances where users' models behaved slightly differently if a breakpoint was set than if it wasn't set, and have therefore added this feature. Create object from this enhancement. We added a right-click option for objects that created a new subclassed object with the object instance property values. We have now added a second right-click option which will only be seen for objects that were originally created from the create object from this. It appears that the object instance you opened it on has its object or model in the current project. Clicking it will update the property defaults on the object or model, and the defaults for any associated nodes, as well as update the property values any existing objects who hold values equal to the previous default to the new default. It will not update any graphical symbols or graphical property options. Task State Log, Entity ID and Entity. We've enhanced the Task State Log to include two new columns including the Entity ID and Entity. These fields were added to provide better dashboard support between various logs. Update to 3D Trimble Warehouse Importing. Based on changes that Trimble 3D Warehouse has recently made, we have had to modify our interface to that application. Now, when a symbol will be added or modified, there is an option to go to 3D Warehouse. Prior was named Download Symbol. This button will put the user in a web browser for 3D Warehouse, where they can search for symbols and download to a SketchUp file. SketchUp files can then be imported using the Import Symbol button. Auto Creation of Objects Enhancement. When using a table to auto-create object instances, users can now specify each object's initial object offset coordinates using geographic values. Object Property has a new location type option to indicate if it uses Cartesian, X, Y, Z, or geographic, latitude, longitude, elevation coordinates. Selecting the default value of Cartesian allows users to enter expressions for X, Y, and Z, which is existing behavior. Selecting the new value of geographic allows users to enter expressions for latitude, -90 to +90, longitude, -180 to +180, and elevation, in meters, which is just like the existing Y Cartesian coordinate, but available here for completeness. Like the X, Y, and Z values, the new latitude, longitude, and elevation values can optionally be specified as table columns and will take their values from the corresponding row in the table. Object instances created using geographic coordinates will remain at those coordinates even if the facility window's map location origin is changed. Transfer Node, Entity Destination Type. We have added an option to the Entity Destination Type property within the Transfer Node object and all fixed objects that contain Transfer Node. The user now has the option upon leaving a Transfer Node to destroy the entity. The new options is None, Destroy Entity.